Eldermont, New Hampshire, was the kind of town where life seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. Nestled among rolling hills and thick forests, the town was a haven of small-town charm. Families had lived here for generations, and everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. At the heart of Eldermont stood Dalton's Hardware, a family-owned store as old as the town itself. It was the kind of place where locals could grab a toolbox, a kind word, and a sense of community all in one visit. For Evan Mitchell Dalton, 28, Dalton's Hardware wasn't just a store, it was his life. The youngest of 3 siblings, Evan had inherited his family's reputation for kindness and dependability. With his soft smile and gentle demeanor, Evan was adored by the locals, yet he often felt weighed down by the responsibilities of running the store alongside caring for his aging parents. His sister Rebecca, who lived in a nearby town, always encouraged him to spread his wings, but Evan's loyalty to his family kept him firmly rooted in Eldermont. Life in Eldermont followed a comforting rhythm, but Evan couldn't help feeling like something was missing. He'd had a few relationships over the years, none of which had gone anywhere serious. He dreamed of finding someone who understood his values, someone who could bring a spark to his otherwise predictable life. That spark arrived one sunny afternoon in April 2022 when Evan walked into Eden's Threads, a boutique in the center of town. He was looking for a birthday gift for his mother when he met Lila Renwick, the store's newest employee. Lila was striking, her auburn hair catching the light as she moved with effortless confidence through the shop. Her warm smile and melodic voice disarmed Evan instantly. "Can I help you find something special?" she asked, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. In that moment, Evan was captivated. Lila exuded an air of mystery that felt worlds away from the grounded simplicity of Eldermont. Over the course of a brief conversation, she helped him pick out a silk scarf for his mother and managed to leave an indelible impression. Over the next few days, Evan couldn't get her out of his mind. Encouraged by his sister to take a chance, he returned to the boutique under the pretense of needing another gift. This time, he worked up the courage to ask Lila out for coffee. To his delight, she said yes, her smile radiant and inviting. Their first date was everything Evan had hoped for. They laughed over shared stories, with Lila drawing out sides of him he hadn't explored in years. She seemed genuinely interested in his life, his family, his dreams, his struggles. Evan, who often felt like a background character in his own life, suddenly felt seen. For the first time in years, he believed he'd found someone who truly understood him. What Evan didn't realize, what no one in Eldermont could have known, was that Lila Renwick had her own reasons for being in town. Behind her charm and elegance lay a history of broken relationships and manipulative tendencies, born from a childhood riddled with chaos and betrayal. To Lila, Evan wasn't just a kind-hearted man, he was an opportunity. His trusting nature and predictable life made him the perfect target for someone like her. As the weeks passed, Evan's world began to change. What started as a whirlwind romance soon became the kind of relationship that consumed him entirely. Friends and family marveled at how happy Evan seemed, but subtle signs of isolation were already starting to show. Eldermont, in all its quiet simplicity, had no idea what darkness was about to unfold. Evan Dalton's life, once defined by its comforting predictability, had taken an exhilarating turn since his chance encounter with Lila Renwick. What began as a simple coffee date quickly blossomed into a whirlwind romance that seemed almost too good to be true. And perhaps it was. Lila had a way of making Evan feel like the center of her universe. She listened intently when he spoke about the pressures of running Dalton's Hardware, offering words of encouragement and a sympathetic smile. "You're such a good man, Evan," she'd say, her green eyes shimmering with sincerity. "Not many people are as selfless as you." Those words meant everything to Evan, who had spent most of his life quietly shouldering the expectations of his family and community. Within weeks, the couple became inseparable. Lila, with her magnetic charm and sophisticated air, was a novelty in Eldermont. She quickly won over many in the community, joining Evan at Sunday lunches with his parents and chatting effortlessly with customers at the hardware store. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect match, a grounded, kind-hearted man and a vibrant, worldly woman. But beneath the surface, something more insidious was taking root. From the very beginning, Lila had been meticulous in her approach. She didn't demand Evan's attention outright. Instead, she subtly redirected it. A lingering look here, a slight pout there, just enough to make him feel like spending time with her was his own decision. Slowly, she began planting seeds of doubt about the people closest to him. It started small. During a dinner with Evan's family, Lila leaned in and whispered, "Your sister Rebecca, she's lovely, but she seems a bit controlling, don't you think? Always asking about your choices, like she doesn't trust you." Evan brushed it off at first, but the comment lingered. Over time, Lila's observations about his sister and others became more frequent. "Rebecca seems so critical of us. Do you think she really wants you to be happy, or, your parents mean well, but don't you feel like they rely on you too much? You deserve to live your own life." Evan, who had always been close to his family, found himself questioning their motives for the first time. Was Rebecca too controlling? Were his parents too dependent on him? Lila never outright told him to distance himself from them. Instead, she framed her concerns as acts of love, making it seem like she only wanted what was best for him. "I just want you to be free to live the life you deserve," she'd say, her voice soft but persuasive. As Evan spent more time with Lila, his relationships with others began to fray. Invitations to grab a beer with old friends were declined in favor of quiet nights at Lila's apartment. Phone calls from Rebecca went unanswered because Lila just wanted to spend some uninterrupted time together. Evan didn't notice the isolation creeping in. He thought he was simply prioritizing the person he loved. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Evan felt the stirrings of unease. Like the time Lila showed up unannounced at the hardware store, claiming she missed him, and then lingered by the counter, watching as he spoke with customers. Or the way her mood would shift if he mentioned spending time with friends. "I just don't understand why you'd want to be with them when you could be with me," she'd say, her tone light but her meaning unmistakable. Evan would apologize, feeling as though he'd done something wrong, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Lila's control over Evan's life continued to deepen. She began suggesting changes to his routine, little things at first. "You work so hard, why don't you let me handle your grocery shopping? You deserve to relax." Evan, eager to please, agreed. Soon, she was accompanying him everywhere, the store, family gatherings, even his weekly volunteer shifts at the local community center. Her presence, once a source of excitement, started to feel suffocating. Yet, whenever he tried to bring it up, Lila would turn the conversation around. "I just love spending time with you. Isn't that what love is supposed to be?" The first real red flag came on a warm evening in late May, during a rare outing with his childhood friend, Liam Parker. Lila had reluctantly agreed to let Evan go fishing with Liam, but not before expressing her disapproval. "I just don't get it," she said, crossing her arms. "You work all week, and instead of wanting to spend your free time with me, you're running off with someone who barely makes an effort to stay in touch with you." Evan assured her it was just one afternoon, but when he returned home, Lila was waiting, her expression a mix of hurt and accusation. "Did you have fun abandoning me?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Evan was taken aback, stumbling through an apology even though he wasn't sure what he'd done wrong. That night, as he lay in bed, a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. But he pushed it aside, telling himself that Lila's feelings were only proof of how much she cared. To the outside world, Evan and Lila still seemed like the perfect couple. They attended town events arm in arm, laughing and smiling as though nothing could ever come between them. But behind closed doors, Evan's world was slowly shrinking. The man who had once been a cornerstone of his community now felt like a shadow of himself, tethered to a love that was becoming increasingly hard to distinguish from control. And yet, he stayed. He told himself that every relationship had its challenges, that Lila's possessiveness was just a sign of her devotion. He didn't know it then, but the seeds of isolation and manipulation had been carefully planted, and they were beginning to bloom into something dark and inescapable. By the time summer settled over Eldermont in 2022, Evan Dalton's life had transformed entirely. What had once been defined by routine and community had now become a world centered around Lila Renwick. The warmth and stability he had always cherished with his family began to feel like a distant memory. What he didn't realize was that while he was consumed by his relationship, those who loved him most were growing deeply concerned. Evan's sister, Rebecca, was the first to notice the cracks. She had always been close to her brother, often calling him just to chat or inviting him over for dinner at her house in nearby Milford. But now, Evan rarely picked up her calls, and when he did, his responses were short and distracted. He always seemed to have a reason not to visit. "Lila and I have plans," or "It's been such a busy week." Rebecca's unease grew with each excuse. Her brother, once so present and dependable, was slipping away. It wasn't just Rebecca. Evelyn and Theodore Dalton, Evan's parents, felt the shift as well. Sunday lunches, a family tradition, had become sporadic at best. When Evan did attend, Lila was always by his side, her presence commanding the room. She was charming and polite, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with Evelyn. "She's too polished," Evelyn confided to Theodore one evening. "Like she's putting on a show." The tipping point came during one such lunch. Lila, perched at the table with her usual poise, turned to Evan and said, "I noticed your mom keeps asking you about the store. It's like she doesn't trust you to run things without her input." Her voice was soft, almost sympathetic, but the effect was immediate. Evan, who had never doubted his mother's intentions, suddenly found himself questioning her comments. Was she being overly critical? Was she trying to interfere? Rebecca, watching the exchange, saw something flicker in Lila's expression, a fleeting look of satisfaction. That was the moment she decided to dig deeper. If her brother wouldn't see the truth, she would uncover it herself. While Rebecca quietly began her investigation, Lila's influence over Evan deepened. It wasn't enough for her to share his life, she wanted to control it. She began suggesting small changes, each one cloaked in the guise of care. "You work so hard, Evan," she'd say, her fingers brushing his arm. "Why don't you let me help with the bookkeeping for the store? It'll give you more time to relax." At first, Evan resisted. The store had always been a family affair, and he didn't want to overstep boundaries. But Lila had a way of wearing him down. Over time, he found himself handing over tasks, grateful for her support but unaware of the growing dependency it was fostering. The isolation was more insidious. Lila never outright forbade Evan from seeing his friends or family. Instead, she planted doubts and wove narratives that made him pull away of his own accord. "Do you ever notice how Rebecca always questions our choices?" she asked one evening. "It's like she doesn't think you're capable of making decisions on your own." Evan, who had always valued his sister's advice, began to view her concern as interference. Even his parents weren't spared. Lila's comments about Evelyn's overbearing nature and Theodore's old-fashioned ways slowly eroded the bond between them. Evan, once a regular presence at the family home, became an infrequent visitor, his absence explained away by Lila's subtle manipulations. Rebecca wasn't about to let her brother drift away without a fight. She began by asking around town, casually inquiring about Lila's background. Most people knew little about her, aside from the fact that she had moved to Eldermont from Larkspur, Connecticut. Curious, Rebecca dug deeper, searching online for any trace of Lila's past. What she found sent chills down her spine. Lila had been involved in a series of tumultuous relationships, several of which had ended abruptly under suspicious circumstances. One former partner, a man named David, had disappeared 2 years earlier. While the case was officially ruled as a missing person with no foul play suspected, there were whispers in Larkspur about Lila's controlling nature and the strain it had put on their relationship. Rebecca's heart raced as she read through the fragmented accounts. Could her brother be heading down the same dangerous path? She knew she had to confront Evan, but the timing had to be right. If she pushed too hard, she risked driving him further into Lila's clutches. Meanwhile, Evan was grappling with his own doubts. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Lila's constant presence, once comforting, now felt suffocating. He missed the easy camaraderie he'd shared with Rebecca and the steady guidance of his parents. Yet, every time he tried to address these feelings, Lila's reaction left him questioning himself. "I feel like I haven't seen my family much lately," he admitted one evening. Lila's response was immediate. "I understand, Evan," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But it hurts when they don't support us. Don't you feel like they've been judging us from the start?" Evan, caught between his love for Lila and his loyalty to his family, found himself paralyzed. He didn't want to believe that the people who had always been his foundation could be against him. But the longer he stayed with Lila, the more blurred those lines became. By the end of the summer, the once vibrant connections in Evan's life had been reduced to strained phone calls and awkward family dinners. Rebecca, armed with her discoveries, knew she had to act soon. But she also knew that Lila was no ordinary adversary. The woman who had captivated her brother was cunning, calculating, and, as Rebecca feared, potentially dangerous. As Eldermont's idyllic autumn leaves began to fall, so too did the last vestiges of Evan's former life. The question was no longer whether Lila had isolated him, but how far she was willing to go to keep him under her control. And whether Evan, torn between love and loyalty, would see the truth before it was too late. By the time autumn blanketed Eldermont in crisp air and vibrant foliage, Rebecca Dalton had unearthed more about Lila Renwick than she ever expected. What began as a quiet investigation born out of concern for her brother had turned into a race against time, a desperate attempt to uncover the truth before it was too late. And the truth about Lila was darker than anyone could have imagined. Rebecca's first break came after a particularly frustrating evening of research. For weeks, she had been combing through online records, social media posts, and small-town news articles, hoping to piece together a clearer picture of the enigmatic woman who had entangled her brother. The name David Markham appeared in several old articles from Larkspur, Connecticut. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a tragic story. David, a 32-year-old architect, had gone missing after a heated breakup with his girlfriend. The girlfriend's name wasn't mentioned, but a gut feeling told Rebecca to keep digging. Her persistence paid off. Buried in the comments of an obscure blog discussing Larkspur's unsolved mysteries was a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "Everyone knows David's ex, Lila Renwick, was involved, but there's no proof. She's a master manipulator." Rebecca's heart pounded as she followed the thread, uncovering more whispers about Lila's past relationships. Patterns began to emerge, each one marked by isolation, control, and eventual collapse. Men who started as devoted partners ended up estranged from their families, their social lives in tatters. In David's case, his disappearance had left behind a trail of unanswered questions and grieving loved ones. Though officially ruled a missing person case with no evidence of foul play, the community's suspicions lingered. Rebecca wasn't ready to confront Evan with this information just yet. She knew her brother well enough to realize he might dismiss her findings as paranoia. Lila had woven herself so deeply into his life that any criticism of her might be seen as an attack on him. Instead, Rebecca decided to quietly gather more evidence. One chilly October afternoon, Rebecca stopped by Dalton's Hardware under the pretense of buying a replacement light fixture. As she browsed the shelves, she watched Evan interact with customers. He seemed off. The easygoing charm that had once been his hallmark was replaced with a quiet hesitance, as if he were second-guessing every move. When she finally approached the counter, she leaned in and asked softly, "How are things, Evan?" "Really?" Evan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was within earshot. "I'm fine, Beck," he said, though his eyes betrayed him. "Just busy." Rebecca pressed gently. "You know you can tell me if something's wrong, right? I've been worried about you." Before Evan could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and Lila walked in. Her presence was like a sudden gust of cold wind. She greeted Rebecca with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rebecca, what a surprise. It's so nice to see you." Rebecca forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Lila had arrived intentionally. As Lila wrapped an arm around Evan's waist, Rebecca noticed the subtle tension in her brother's shoulders. She left the store that day more determined than ever to protect him. Rebecca's next step was a bold one. She drove 2 hours to Larkspur, a small town nestled in Connecticut's rolling hills, hoping to speak with someone who might remember Lila. Her search led her to the Corner Cafe, a cozy diner frequented by locals. Armed with an old photograph of Lila she had printed from Facebook, Rebecca struck up conversations with the staff and patrons. Her persistence was rewarded when an older waitress squinted at the photo and said, "Oh, that's Lila. She used to come in here with David all the time. Poor guy. He adored her." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "What happened to David?" she asked. The waitress sighed, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "He vanished a couple of years ago. Everyone says he ran off after their breakup, but I don't know. There was something off about her. Sweet as pie one moment, cold as ice the next. David wasn't himself those last few months, stopped coming around, cut off his friends. She had him wrapped around her finger." Rebecca left the diner with a growing sense of dread. If Lila had a history of isolating her partners and leaving destruction in her wake, then Evan could very well be her next victim. While Rebecca was piecing together the puzzle, Evan was beginning to feel the strain of his relationship with Lila. Her constant presence, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating. She questioned his every decision, monitored his interactions, and even began making subtle changes to the store's operations without consulting him. The final straw came during a quiet evening at Lila's apartment. As they sat on the couch, Evan mentioned missing his family. Lila's response was immediate. "I understand, Evan, but you have to admit, they've never really supported us. Your sister, especially. She's always meddling." Evan frowned. "Rebecca's just protective. She cares about me." Lila's expression hardened, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Caring doesn't mean trying to drive a wedge between us. Do you think she wants you to be happy?" For the first time, Evan felt a pang of doubt, not about Rebecca, but about Lila. The thought unsettled him, yet he couldn't shake it. Was Lila right? Or was she trying to control him in ways he was only beginning to recognize? Rebecca returned to Eldermont with the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her. She knew she had to tell Evan the truth about Lila's past, but timing was everything. Lila was cunning, manipulative, and fiercely protective of the control she had over Evan. Confronting her directly could push her to retaliate. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the tension in the Dalton family deepened. The truth about Lila was out there, waiting to be revealed. But would Evan see it before it was too late? Or would Rebecca's warnings come too late to save her brother from the same fate as David Markham? The air in Eldermont was growing colder as winter crept closer, but within Evan Dalton's world, a different kind of chill had settled in, a suffocating, inescapable sense of unease. His once comforting relationship with Lila Renwick had transformed into something far darker, though he couldn't yet admit it to himself. He was torn between the love he had for her and the increasing strain of her constant control. But everything came to a head on a gray afternoon in late November, when Evan finally found the courage to confront the truth. Rebecca Dalton could wait no longer. Armed with the troubling information she had uncovered in Larkspur, she arranged to meet Evan for coffee at the quaint Maple Street Cafe, a quiet spot away from Lila's prying eyes. Evan seemed reluctant but agreed, his expression guarded as he slid into the booth opposite Rebecca. "Thanks for meeting me," Rebecca said softly, her tone careful. She knew one wrong word could make him shut down. "I've been worried about you." Evan hesitated, his fingers toying with the edge of his coffee mug. "I'm fine, Beck. Things have just been busy." Rebecca took a deep breath. "Evan, I need you to listen to me. It's about Lila." She saw his shoulders tense but pressed on. "I went to Larkspur. I talked to people who knew her." Evan's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "You what?" "I had to," Rebecca said, her voice firm but pleading. "She's not who you think she is. There's a pattern, Evan, men she's been with, isolated from their families, and it never ends well. One of them, David Markham, disappeared after they broke up. People in Larkspur think she was involved." Evan stared at her, his face pale. "That's ridiculous. Lila's not, she wouldn't." "She's manipulative, Evan," Rebecca interrupted gently. "You've been pulling away from everyone, me, Mom, Dad. That's not you. That's her influence." For a long moment, Evan didn't speak. His mind raced, Rebecca's words colliding with Lila's constant reassurances. He felt a creeping doubt, a crack in the narrative Lila had constructed. "I don't know what you expect me to do," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just think about it," Rebecca urged. "Look at how things have changed since she came into your life. If you're happy, really happy, then fine. But if you're not, don't let her take over your life." Evan returned home that evening, his mind clouded with conflicting emotions. Lila greeted him at the door with her usual warmth, but he couldn't meet her eyes. She immediately noticed. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Did something happen?" For the first time, Evan hesitated before answering. "I talked to Rebecca today." Lila's expression darkened, the softness in her eyes replaced by something colder. "Oh? And what did she have to say about me this time?" "She went to Larkspur," Evan admitted, bracing for her reaction. "She told me things about your past." Lila's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Your sister has hated me from the beginning. She'll say anything to drive us apart." Evan's stomach twisted. "She's just worried about me. And honestly, I'm starting to worry too." Lila's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the carefully curated mask she wore cracked. "So, what?" she snapped. "You believe her over me? After everything we've been through?" "It's not about choosing sides," Evan said, his voice shaking. "It's about how I feel. I've been feeling trapped." Lila took a step closer, her tone shifting to one of desperation. "Trapped? Evan, I love you. Everything I've done has been because I love you. How can you say that?" Evan's heart pounded as he looked at her, the woman he had once thought was his future. "Maybe it's too much, Lila. Maybe, we need some space." For a moment, Lila was silent, her expression unreadable. Then, like a master performer, she shifted gears. Her voice softened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't want to tell you this yet," she whispered, her hand resting on her stomach. "But I'm pregnant." Evan's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "I'm pregnant, Evan," she repeated, her voice trembling. "I found out last week. I wanted it to be a surprise, but now I don't know what to do." The words hit him like a freight train. All the doubts, the warnings from Rebecca, the growing unease, they evaporated in the face of this revelation. If it was true, everything changed. His duty wasn't just to himself anymore, it was to the life Lila claimed they had created together. But something about the timing nagged at him. Why now? Why, just as he was beginning to question everything, did she drop this bombshell? Over the next few days, Evan wrestled with his thoughts. Lila, sensing his hesitation, became more attentive than ever. She cooked his favorite meals, lavished him with affection, and spoke excitedly about their future as a family. To anyone else, it might have seemed genuine, but to Evan, it felt calculated. Finally, late one evening, he made his decision. "I need to know the truth," he told Rebecca in a hushed phone call. "About everything. Then you have to be prepared for what you'll find," she warned. "I am," Evan said, though he wasn't sure it was true. He knew only one thing for certain: the life he was living with Lila could not continue. Whether her announcement was real or another layer of manipulation, he had to confront her, and this time, there would be no turning back. As the first snow of the season began to fall over Eldermont, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The mask Lila had worn so carefully was beginning to slip, and Evan, for the first time, was determined to see what lay beneath. The snow in Eldermont had thickened overnight, blanketing the quiet town in a deceptive stillness. Yet, in the shadows of this peaceful scene, the final chapter of Evan Dalton's story was beginning to unfold. He had resolved to confront Lila Renwick, to uncover the truth and reclaim the pieces of himself that had been slowly eroded. But what Evan didn't realize was that Lila, feeling her control slipping away, was prepared to go to terrifying lengths to keep him. Evan chose a Sunday afternoon for the confrontation. The hardware store was closed, and most of Eldermont's residents were tucked away in their homes, avoiding the biting cold. He asked Lila to meet him at Eldermont Park, a secluded area on the edge of town where they had often walked in happier days. It was a place that held memories of love but now served as the backdrop for a confrontation that would forever mar its serenity. Lila arrived wearing her usual polished demeanor, but Evan could see the tension in her every movement. She smiled as she approached, though it didn't reach her eyes. "What's this about, Evan?" she asked, her voice light but guarded. Evan stood near a wooden bench, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "I need to talk to you, Lila. About us." Lila's smile faltered. "You're scaring me," she said, taking a step closer. "What's going on?" Evan took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how things have changed since we met. And I don't think this is working anymore." Her expression hardened instantly. "What are you talking about?" "You've been controlling me," Evan said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Isolating me from my family, my friends. I can't keep doing this." Lila's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly masked it with a veneer of hurt. "Controlling you? Evan, I've done nothing but love you. Everything I've done has been for us." "That's not love, Lila," Evan said, his voice rising. "It's manipulation. And Rebecca, she told me about Larkspur, about David. I need to know the truth." For a moment, Lila froze. Her carefully crafted facade cracked, revealing a flicker of something darker. "Rebecca," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "She's been trying to poison you against me from the beginning." "This isn't about Rebecca," Evan shot back. "It's about you. About how you've made me feel trapped, like I don't even recognize myself anymore." Lila's expression twisted into something unrecognizable, a mix of fury and desperation. "You're not leaving me, Evan," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "We're going to have a baby. Do you even care about that?" Evan's resolve wavered for a moment, but then he shook his head. "I don't even know if that's true," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't trust anything you say anymore. Lila's composure shattered entirely. "You think you can just walk away from me?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty park. "After everything I've done for you?" Evan stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but before he could turn, Lila reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a knife. The glint of the blade caught the pale winter sunlight, sending a jolt of fear through Evan. "Lila," he said carefully, raising his hands. "You don't have to do this." Her eyes burned with a terrifying intensity. "You think you can ruin my life? After I gave you everything?" She lunged at him, the knife slicing through the air. Evan dodged, his heart pounding as he stumbled backward. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't want to do this." But Lila was beyond reason. She attacked again, her movements frantic and wild. Evan managed to grab her wrist, trying desperately to disarm her without hurting her. "Lila, please," he begged. "This isn't you. Don't tell me who I am," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. In the chaos, the knife slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. For a moment, it seemed like the worst had passed. But then Lila lunged for the knife again, grabbing it with trembling hands. This time, Evan wasn't fast enough. The blade plunged into his side, and a sharp, searing pain shot through him. He stumbled, clutching his wound, as the snow beneath him began to stain crimson. Lila stood over him, her chest heaving as she stared at what she'd done. For a moment, her rage dissolved into shock. "Evan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the snowy ground. "It didn't have to be this way," he murmured, his voice weak. "It didn't have to end like this." Lila fled the scene, leaving Evan's lifeless body in the park as the first stars of the evening began to pierce the cold winter sky. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind racing with thoughts of escape and the weight of what she had done. The next morning, Evan's body was discovered by a passerby, and the small town of Eldermont was thrown into shock. The local police launched an immediate investigation, led by Detective Simon Carter, who quickly pieced together the events leading to Evan's death. Witnesses, phone records, and the discovery of the murder weapon at Lila's apartment left no doubt about her guilt. When Lila was finally apprehended at a motel on the outskirts of the state, she offered little resistance. Her once perfect composure had crumbled entirely, leaving behind a woman consumed by her own demons. As the case unfolded, the depth of Lila's manipulations came to light. She had fabricated her pregnancy, just as Rebecca had suspected, as a last-ditch effort to keep Evan under her control. Her history of abusive relationships and suspicious circumstances surrounding her past partners painted a chilling picture of a woman driven by fear of abandonment and a need for dominance. At her trial, the prosecution laid bare the full scope of her actions, and the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Lila Renwick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Evan Dalton's funeral was held on a cold December morning, attended by the entire community of Eldermont. His parents, Rebecca, and the townsfolk mourned not only the loss of a kind-hearted man but the life he could have had if he had been able to escape Lila's grasp. In the months that followed, Rebecca vowed to honor her brother's memory by raising awareness about emotional abuse and manipulation. "If we had recognized the signs earlier," she said in a tearful interview, "maybe we could have saved him." Evan's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the quiet dangers that can lurk behind a facade of love. And though his life ended in tragedy, the truth of his story sparked a ripple of awareness that would help others recognize and escape the darkness before it was too late. The trial of Lila Renwick became the talk of Eldermont and beyond. A town unaccustomed to such horrors now found itself the focus of statewide media. Reporters descended on the quiet streets, seeking to piece together the story of how a seemingly perfect relationship had ended in tragedy. For the Dalton family, however, the spectacle of the trial was secondary to their grief and their need for justice. The prosecution's case against Lila Renwick was airtight. Detective Simon Carter, the lead investigator, presented the timeline of events with painstaking precision. Phone records, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence painted a damning picture of a woman who had manipulated, controlled, and ultimately killed the man she claimed to love. The most incriminating piece of evidence was the knife found in Lila's apartment, still bearing Evan's blood. Ballistic testing confirmed it matched the wounds that ended his life. Additional phone records revealed a chilling pattern of obsessive calls and texts to Evan in the weeks leading up to his death, underscoring her desperate need to maintain control. Witnesses, including Rebecca Dalton and several townspeople, testified about the changes they had seen in Evan during his relationship with Lila. "He wasn't the same," Rebecca said tearfully on the stand. "She isolated him, made him doubt everyone who cared about him. And when he finally tried to break free, she took everything from him." Lila's defense team argued that she had acted in a moment of emotional turmoil, citing her traumatic upbringing as a mitigating factor. They painted her as a victim of her own past, a woman desperate for love and stability who lashed out in a moment of fear and confusion. But the jury, faced with overwhelming evidence of premeditation and manipulation, saw through this narrative. After only a few hours of deliberation, the verdict came: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge sentenced Lila to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Dalton family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring Evan back. In the weeks following the trial, Rebecca struggled to find meaning in her brother's death. The weight of guilt lingered. What if she had confronted Evan sooner? What if she had pushed harder? These questions haunted her, but she refused to let them consume her. Instead, she channeled her grief into action. Rebecca began working with local advocacy groups focused on emotional abuse and toxic relationships. She shared Evan's story in interviews, podcasts, and community meetings, determined to raise awareness about the warning signs of manipulation. "People think abuse is only physical," she said during one appearance. But emotional and psychological abuse can be just as devastating. It can isolate you, make you doubt yourself, and trap you in a cycle that's almost impossible to escape. She also worked with the local high school to introduce workshops on healthy relationships, ensuring young people in Eldermont had the tools to recognize red flags before it was too late. The community rallied behind her efforts, turning Evan's story into a catalyst for change. For Evelyn and Theodore Dalton, healing came slowly. Losing their youngest son left a hole that could never be filled, but they found comfort in the community's support. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers reached out with messages of condolence and solidarity. The Daltons hosted a memorial at Dalton's Hardware, inviting everyone to share stories about Evan's kindness and the impact he had on their lives. "It helps to know how much he was loved," Evelyn said during the gathering, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Evan had a way of making people feel seen, heard, and cared for. That's what we'll remember. Rebecca, too, found moments of solace in her memories of Evan. She often visited Eldermont Park, the place where her brother's life had ended, to reflect and find peace. On one such visit, she planted a tree in his memory, a young oak that would grow strong and steady, just as Evan had once been. Evan's death sent shockwaves through Eldermont, forcing the town to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse and control. The idea that someone like Lila, who had seemed so poised and charming, could harbor such darkness was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The local church hosted a series of workshops on building healthier relationships and breaking free from cycles of manipulation. Counselors and advocates were invited to speak, sharing resources for those who might be experiencing abuse in silence. It became a town-wide mission to ensure that no one else would suffer as Evan had. Beyond Eldermont, Evan's story resonated with people across the state and beyond. Media coverage of the trial brought attention to the often overlooked issue of emotional abuse. Advocacy organizations began using Evan's case as an example of why recognizing the signs of manipulation and control was so crucial. In one particularly poignant moment, Rebecca received a letter from a woman in another town. "Your brother's story saved my life," it read. "I saw myself in his struggles, and it gave me the courage to leave a relationship I'd been trapped in for years. Thank you for sharing his story." As time passed, the pain of Evan's loss remained, but so did his legacy. The tree planted in his honor grew taller with each passing year, its branches spreading wide as if to embrace the town he had loved so dearly. The lessons learned from his story became a permanent part of Eldermont's fabric, a reminder to always look out for one another and to speak up against injustice. For Rebecca, the fight was far from over. She continued her work, determined to ensure that her brother's death would not be in vain. Evan's life was about kindness and connection, she said during a community event. If his story can help even one person break free from a toxic relationship, then he hasn't truly left us. The story of Evan Dalton and Lila Renwick was one of love turned toxic, trust betrayed, and lives shattered. But it was also a story of resilience, justice, and the power of community. It served as a stark reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is hope, and that by standing together, we can create a world where no one has to face such darkness alone. As the years passed, Eldermont began to heal. The memory of Evan Dalton's tragic death remained etched in the hearts of everyone who had known him, but it also served as a catalyst for change. His story became a lesson in vigilance and compassion, a reminder that danger can sometimes hide behind a smile, and that love, when twisted by control and manipulation, can become something deadly. The oak tree planted in Eldermont Park in Evan's honor grew stronger each year, its roots digging deep into the soil, just as Evan had been rooted in the community he loved. The townsfolk often paused beneath its shade, reflecting on the man whose quiet kindness had touched so many lives. A plaque beneath the tree bore his name, along with the words, "In memory of a life taken too soon," and a reminder to always choose kindness and courage. Rebecca Dalton continued to carry her brother's legacy forward. She became a passionate advocate for raising awareness about emotional and psychological abuse, sharing Evan's story far and wide. Her work inspired countless others to examine their own relationships and speak out against the silent suffering that so often accompanies manipulation and control. Through her efforts, Rebecca helped establish the Evan Dalton Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing resources for those trapped in abusive relationships. The foundation funded counseling services, support groups, and education programs, ensuring that others would have the tools Evan hadn't. "If we can prevent just one more tragedy," Rebecca often said, "then Evan's story will have made a difference." In Eldermont, the impact of Evan's story was profound. Once a place where such horrors seemed unimaginable, the town now embraced open conversations about difficult topics. Schools introduced programs on recognizing toxic behaviors, and community centers offered free seminars on emotional well-being and healthy relationships. The local police department partnered with advocacy groups to ensure better support for victims of domestic and emotional abuse. The people of Eldermont rallied around the Daltons, their shared grief evolving into a collective determination to honor Evan's memory. His death, though heartbreaking, had given the town a newfound strength and unity. Evan's story extended far beyond the boundaries of Eldermont. News coverage of the trial and Rebecca's advocacy work brought national attention to the subtle yet devastating nature of emotional abuse. Podcasts, documentaries, and articles explored the nuances of his case, sparking conversations in communities across the country. The Evan Dalton Foundation received letters and messages from people who had been inspired by his story to make changes in their own lives. Many shared how they had found the courage to leave toxic relationships or help loved ones recognize the signs of manipulation. For every story of heartbreak, there was one of hope, a testament to the power of Evan's legacy. For Rebecca, Evelyn, and Theodore Dalton, moving forward was a daily act of courage. The loss of Evan would never fade, but they found solace in the love they still shared and the knowledge that his life, though cut short, had made an indelible impact. Each year on the anniversary of his death, the community gathered beneath the oak tree in Eldermont Park for a candlelight vigil. It was a time to honor Evan, reflect on the lessons his story had taught, and recommit to building a world where love was free from fear and control. The story of Evan Dalton and Lila Renwick is a stark reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse and the importance of recognizing its signs. Love should never isolate, manipulate, or control. It should uplift, empower, and bring joy. What do you think about Evan's story? Did it resonate with you or remind you of someone you know? Have you ever encountered signs of emotional or psychological abuse in a relationship, either your own or someone else's? How did you respond? What steps can we take as individuals and communities to prevent tragedies like this from happening? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your perspective could be the first step in helping someone else recognize they're not alone. If you or someone you know is in a toxic or abusive relationship, resources are available to help. Don't wait, reach out, speak up, and take action. Together, we can make a difference.